Alright, David Harry here, and in this video I'm going to be doing some SSD speed testing with the base version of the M4 Mac Mini, and it is going to be inside the Acasis M4 Mac Mini workstation. It does actually have a serial number, but I can't remember it, but it is basically the M4 Mac Mini workstation. Now inside of it I have got two SSDs, and these are both identical. These are the Western Digital 4TB SN850X SSDs. So what I'm going to specifically do here is to do 4 different speed tests. I'm going to speed test the SSDs individually, then I'm going to test a JBOD configuration, then a RAID 1 configuration, and also a RAID 0 configuration. Now, due to the length of all these tests, I will not be doing any deep diving about the actual enclosure in this video. However, there will be a video soon where I do a lot of deep diving about the enclosure and go over all of its ports and what it can and it can't do and stuff like that. However, what I will do before I get into the speed testing is just to quickly show you how to connect the SSDs and stuff. Anyway, I think that's probably it for the intro. However, for the outro or the end summary, I will do some stuff there which I may have forgotten to do during the intro, and also there is probably one really big technical thing about this type of enclosure that needs explaining, and I will also do that at the end with my end summary. And also, for anybody interested, there's gonna be links and stuff in the video description, and also a discount code for the Acasis website. And also, maybe you should start asking, but if you find the video useful and stuff like that, please do give it a thumbs up, and a sub to the channel would be absolutely awesome. Okay, so the first thing that I will do is to show you how we use these thermal pads, because it may not be super obvious immediately. And the other thing as well here, this pad has already been used, so it does look a little bit grotty. However, I've had to put the cellophane layer back on it just so I could show you how to do this. So anyway, on one side we have a cellophane protective layer. So if I just pull it off here, we should be able to see. So there we go, there's the cellophane layer that we have to pull off. Now I'm going to leave this on just for now, but when I actually do the SSD installation I will pull it off, but I'm showing you it here just so you can see exactly what's going on. Now on this side here, see this actual surface, although it looks like it's got something that you would pull off it, it doesn't. So this side here, it's it feels like almost like a thick paper or something. Whatever you do not try to remove that. It does not come off, or you'll end up doing what I done, which is basically just completely wreck the actual thermal pad there. Anyways, like I say, I'm just showing you this straight away because it may not be super obvious when I do the close-ups now as I install the SSDs. Now the first thing that we need to do is to remove this cover from the SSD compartment, and to do that there's a single screw down here, and the actual enclosure does come with the correct screwdriver as well. So what we need to do is just get that screwdriver and then just untighten that screw that holds in the cover for the enclosure part there, and then that will just simply come off like that. So now the next thing to do is to connect the SSDs. Now if you only plan on using one SSD, you can use either of the M.2 sockets here. It doesn't matter which one you use if you're only going to use one SSD. Now to insert the SSD, as we're going to see here, the SSD has a notch or a cutout on it here, and then hopefully we can get to see something here, but on the M.2 sockets here, they actually have a guide pin on them, which basically means that you can only put the SSD in one way round, so you can't get it in the wrong way round. So what I'm going to do is just pop that SSD in there. Now just give it a bit of a push until you can't push it any further. Don't push it too much, but you know, you just put a little bit of force on, and then that will connect itself into the M.2 slot. Now at this point here, we should be able to see the SSD holds itself into place and almost goes like a bit springy, and that will just indicate that the SSD is connected. Now the next thing to do is to use one of these rubber standoffs that comes with the enclosure, and this is used to fasten down the SSD to the inside of the compartment here. Now there's actually two of these, but you obviously only need to use one per SSD, and basically what it is, it's got a groove on it which you just slide over that end there on the SSD, so it kind of fits perfectly onto that half cutout on the SSD. And then just under it here, in fact we can see it there, there's a hole there in the enclosure. So what happens is we push that down, and then that rubber stopper will connect into the hole and fasten down the SSD. And then what we need to do is to connect two of these thermal pads to the SSD, and as it's shown you just before, we just pull off the one side which has got this, like, you know, cellophane layer on it, and then that side where we've just pulled it off from, we put that down onto the SSD. So let me just do that. And then we just apply the second thermal pad on top of the first thermal pad. Once again, we just pull off that protective cellophane layer off the second pad, and then put that down on the side that we've just taken off onto the first thermal pad, and then that is one of the SSDs installed with its thermal pads. Now of course at this point, if you're just using one SSD, then you can just then go and put the cover back on the enclosure. However, if you are going to use two SSDs, then just do the exact same procedure with the second SSD until you've got your two SSDs fully installed with their thermal pads. And then to complete the installation, we just need to put the cover back on over the SSD compartment. Now this cover will only go on one way, and we've got like a little slight notch at the top here, and that fits into a little cutout at the top there. So like I say, only go in one way. And then what we need to do is to just screw down that screw back on to fasten it on. Now I do have to mention here, this can be a little bit fiddly, but just bear with it. And then, oh actually that's gone on first time, so that wasn't so fiddly for me. However, it can be a little bit fiddly, but just take your time and bear with it, tighten it back on, and now that is all complete. Now just a quick bit of advice here. Although the dock will actually power up using the power of the Thunderbolt port from the M4 Mac Mini that we connect it to, as in we get that short cable that comes with the dock, we just connect it to any one of the three Thunderbolt ports on the back there, and then we connect that to the port here that says host on the dock. Now, like I say, technically speaking, that will all work as far as the power is concerned. However, if you're using two SSDs, and maybe those SSDs are like a little bit power hungry, and also you may be plugging other things into the dock, you may run out of power, and you may like kind of like underperform with some of the stuff such as the SSDs, or you could possibly even get disconnects because of a lack of power. Well, my recommendation is to use the actual power supply that comes with the enclosure, and what you do, you just use that power supply with the supplied C cable that comes with it, and then we just connect that to the socket here that says PD. So we're just adding extra power now to the actual dock or the enclosure system. And so with the addition of this 30-watt power supply, we definitely won't run into any powering issues with either two SSDs or the combination of the SSDs and whatever else might be drawing power from the actual enclosure itself. And then finally, to activate the enclosure, it does have its own power button, which makes the enclosure independent from the M4 Mac Mini that's inside of it. So no matter how you are powering it, whether it is just only with the M4 Mac Mini's power via Thunderbolt, or you add the extra power supply, you have to click on the power button to activate the enclosure and therefore activate the SSDs as well. Now you can click and power that on before you even boot up the Mac if you're using the external power supply, or you can kind of switch it off and on whilst the Mac is on. However, if you are going to switch this off whilst the Mac is on, make sure to eject the disks first. So what you don't want to be doing is just switching it off whilst the Mac is on without ejecting the disks. Anyway, let me now move on to the actual speed tests.
Okay, so the first thing that I will do is to format the two 4TB SSDs individually and then run some quick speed tests on them using the Blackmagic Disk Speed Test app. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is go to Disk Utility. Now I'm going to go to the first SSD here, go to Arrays. I'm going to call this, let's see, 4TB1. I'm going to format to the APFS format using the GUID partition mapping scheme. So let me tap on Arrays there. I'll do all this stuff in real time just so you can see exactly what's going on. However, just to be clear, these SSDs don't have any data on them, so they will format really quickly. If you are going to be formatting SSDs that have already got a lot of data on them, they will take longer to format, and some of them can take very long to format depending upon how much data is on them. Okay, so I'll go to the second one now, tap on Arrays here, and I will call this one wrong name, it's not E, it's 4TB2, and that's going to be APFS GUID. I'll just erase that. Again, I'll just do this in real time because it's going to be really quick, because once again the disk had no data on it, and this should be done very quickly. There we go, so done, and I will exit the disk utility there. Now what I'm going to do is just do a quick kind of like, benchmark test with the two SSDs on their own before we go any further. So Blackmagic Disk Speed Test app, I'm just going to pop into here. I'm going to select 4TB1. Now, if I just start here, we're going to see that this will be just over 1400 megabytes per second for the write and just over 1500 megabytes per second for the read. Now, that will vary ever so slightly across a number of different tests, but basically we're just over 1400 for the write and just over 1500 for the read. So let me stop that. Now, as we should expect, the other drive should do the exact same thing because it is the exact same model of drive. However, it is always best to be able to test these things thoroughly rather than just assume stuff. So let's try this. As we can see there, just over 1400 megabytes per second for the write and just over 1500 megabytes per second for the read. So basically, give or take maybe a few megabytes, both of these SSDs are, as we would expect, operating exactly the same. Now, just for good measure, what I'm going to do is to test the internal storage of the Mac Mini. So I'll go to my home folder. Let's test this. Now, this might go a little bit funky on some of the pass-throughs here, which is something that I find does happen. However, so far we are just over 2000 for the write and we are around 2900 for the read. Okay, so those numbers there actually look quite stable. What I was kind of getting at just then is that every now and then when I do these tests on my M4 Mac Mini, the write speed one kind of goes all over the place sometimes. However, this will give us a good gauge of what's going on. So around 2000 for the write and just around, say, or just under, say, 3000 for the read. And just to be clear, the reason why I am showing you this is because I will be doing the data transferring using an external drive, because as we will see later on in the tests, the write speed of the internal drive for the M4 Mac Mini would actually become a problem and a bottleneck, which is why I will be using an external SSD for transferring the data in and out of the 4TB SSDs within their various RAID modes. Anyway, with all that said and done, it is now time to start testing for the RAID modes, and I think the first thing that I will do is to test for JBOD. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is to create a JBOD set. So what I'm going to do is to launch Disk Utility. I'm going to come up to where it says File up here and then come down to RAID Assistant. So let me get into RAID Assistant here. So what I'm going to do is to tap on where it says Concatenated JBOD. So let me just tap on there. Now what this is JBOD stands for just a bunch of disks. I mean, literally, it just means just a bunch of disks. And also, this is actually something here which is a bit of a weird thing, I think, because RAID itself stands for Redundant Array of Independent Disks. Now, the important word in RAID is redundant, which basically means that's where you get some form of backup and protection. So you've got redundant data within inside a RAID set. Now, the thing with JBOD, it does not have any redundancy. So basically what's going to happen here is these two SSDs are going to be stitched together in such a way that they look like a single 8 terabyte SSD. And then what will happen is when data is written to the first SSD, once that fills up, the data then kind of just jumps over to the second SSD to continue to be written to. So effectively, it's just two SSDs still acting independently but stitched together. Now, in this instance, if anything happens to any one of the SSDs, then the whole JBOD set goes down, which means that we've got absolutely zero protection, so no redundancy whatsoever. So just remember that. So as far as I'm concerned, it's not really a RAID. Anyway, so let me just tap on next. Now I'm going to select both of the SSDs there and then tap on next. Now, as far as chunk size is concerned, because the data that I'm typically using is going to be large bits of data, things like video files, audio files, picture files and such, I'm going to use a chunk size of 256K, which gives me the advantage of being able to write faster when it comes to larger bits of data. However, if you were, say, going to be using tons and tons of tiny files, maybe some kind of like web server application or something like that, then you would be best off going to 16K, because 16K, as far as the chunk sizes are concerned, will give you better or faster access times, which is definitely going to be an advantage when using a lot of tiny files being moved around all the time. Okay, so like I say, 256K for me, and then I'm going to select APFS because that's going to be our fastest option. Now, as far as the name is concerned, I'm going to call this there's a space, JBOD. Okay, so there's my JBOD done. I'm going to tap on next and create. Now, I'll do this in real time because it's going to happen really quickly. Now, to be clear, the reason why this is going to happen quickly is because there was no data on those disks anyway. The more data you have on a disk when it comes to doing any type of formatting, the longer it is going to take to do the format. Okay, so that's done there. Let me exit disk utility. Now, what I'm going to do here is to go to the Blackmagic Disk Speed Test. Let me go and select the JBOD. There we go. And now, even before I run this test, we can probably guess now already that this is going to be the exact same speed as it was earlier on with the single drives. Okay, so let me just do this. And there we go. Just over 1400 for the write. And then it's just going to be over 1500 for the read. There we go. So exactly basically the same speed as an individual disk was earlier on. And quite obviously the reason why is because we are just writing and reading to one of the same disks that we already had, but it's just now within a JBOD set. Okay, so let me stop that and come out of there. Now what I'm going to do is to attach my external SSD. Let me just get this on. This should pop up momentarily on the desktop. There we go. So as you can see, 8TB SN850X TB1201 Pro. As I've already shown probably on the introduction, this is just an Acasis TB1201 Pro enclosure with an 8TB SN850X with inside of it. Okay, so what I'm going to do first of all is to open up Activity Monitor. Now, for these particular tests, what we're going to be doing is looking at the speeds within Activity Monitor. It is not worth me doing things where I'm going to time massive amounts of data, and the reason why is because I've already done a lot of videos using these particular SSDs, and we know that they've got a really high cache limit on them, so they will maintain their fastest speeds for either 1 terabyte or 2 terabyte. So we're going to get like massively fast speeds for a long time with these types of SSDs. But more importantly, for this particular test is for us to see the actual speed just in general as we're moving data. So basically activity monitor and its readings here are going to be good for just like observing general data movements and speeds and stuff. Okay, so I'm going to open up JBOD here. Okay, let me get it up there a bit. That should be good. Then I'll open up this one here. I will go to speed test folders. Now what I'm going to do is just use this 30 gigabytes speed test files folder here and move it backwards and forwards. So the first thing I'm going to do is to move it to the JBOD, and then this is going to give us an idea of the right speed for the JBOD. So there we go. Now let's have a look at this number down here where it says data written per second. And as you can see there, that's 1.44 gigabytes per second, 1.47. Now it's going to hover somewhere around there, 1.48. So as you can see, that is basically in keeping with what we'd seen with the Blackmagic Disk Speed Test. And in fact, it's probably slightly faster actually than what the Blackmagic Disk Speed was saying. So what I'm going to do now is to erase that 30 gigabytes folder from the external, and now I'm going to just drag this 30 gigabytes back to the external. And so what we're going to be doing now is testing for the read speed of the JBOD, and there we go. Now let's have a look at this. Okay, now on the way back, this is now, well, that reached 1.61, 1.64. Okay, so that is actually a little tiny bit more faster again than what Blackmagic Disk Speed Test was saying. So that's, I don't know, that's probably about 1.64 quite consistently actually. Okay, so what we've seen there then is that when we have got, like, you know, the disks in this JBOD configuration, we are actually getting decent speeds out of them, and we are basically getting the same speed as what we would have done on any one singular disk as well. And as you can see there as well, in the real world, we were actually getting like slightly faster speeds than what we were seeing within the Blackmagic Disk Speed Test. Okay, so with that done then, let me move on to the RAID 1 configuration. Okay, so just before I create this RAID 1, what I'm going to do is to eject and disconnect my external 8TB SSD. And the reason for that, and this is something that I always say to people when I start doing things like, you know, erasing disks and formatting, is I do not want to accidentally wipe out that disk and basically make it part of a JBOD or a RAID or something, because that disk has got a ton of data on, which I would be extremely unhappy about if I deleted it. Okay, so what I'm going to do then is go back to Disk Utility. I'm going to come up to here. Oh, in fact, before we go to RAID Assistant, what we need to do first of all is to delete the RAID. So on the main page for Disk Utility, just scroll down to the bottom here, and then we'll see RAID. And then what we need to do is delete RAID. Okay, so we'll delete the RAID, and then that's our two disks now just kind of put back to being blank. We'll just say done there, and now we will go to File, RAID Assistant, and then we'll get on to mirrored RAID 1. Let me do next there. I'll select the two drives that I want to be part of this mirrored set. Then I'll tap on next. Once again, I am going to do 256K chunk size. I'm going to do APFS, and then I'm going to call this RAID 1. Okay, so let me just pop that on there and do create. Now let me just explain very quickly what RAID 1 is. And out of these three options that we've got within inside macOS, this is actually the only true RAID option that we've got. As I've already explained, JBOD isn't really a RAID setting. RAID 1 definitely is, and RAID 0 is not, and I will explain about RAID 0 when we get there. However, as far as RAID 1 is concerned, what is happening here now is that when the data gets written to the RAID 1 set, the data then gets spread twice, one onto the first drive and then the second one onto the second drive. So for instance, if we were to say move, say, a music file over, that music file simultaneously gets written to both of the SSDs and is basically the exact same data just going on to both. Now, of course, because we are actually using the same data on both SSDs, we don't gain any extra space. So when we have put two 4 terabyte drives together into RAID 1, we don't get 8 terabytes. We only get 1 terabyte of actual usable written space or usable space for writing. However, what this does mean though is that if one of those disks gets damaged or becomes corrupted or anything like that, we will not lose our data because we've got all that data on the other disk. So this truly is a redundant system, or basically a system which has got data protection within it because we've got 2 copies of the data. Okay, so with that said, let me click on done. I will come out of the disk utility. Now, of course, having said what I've just said, when we have a look at the properties here, this is only going to be 4 terabytes, and there we go, 4 terabytes. Okay, so what I'm going to do is to open up Activity Monitor. Let me open up the RAID 1. I'll put this up here. Now, there's going to be something interesting that we will see here within Activity Monitor, which I think is basically, it's an error within Activity Monitor, but I will show you this now. Oh, in fact, I need to reattach my 8 terabytes so I can start moving data from it. Okay, so this should pop up momentarily on the desktop. There we go. So let me get onto my speed test folder. Now what I'm going to do for this first pass here, I'm going to use the 100 gig test folder. And the reason why is because I'm going to have to explain a bunch of things here. And that 30 gig speed test files folder will be well, it'll go too quickly, and I want to explain some stuff here and talk more, so I'm using 100 gigs. Okay, so shut up, Dave, and get on with it. There we go, 100 gigs. Now check this out. So the data written speed here, as we can see, is basically just under 3 gigabytes per second. However, as we just seen in the Blackmagic speed test, the write speed was more like, you know, whatever, you know, between 1400 to 1500 megabytes, so 1.4 to 1.5. However, suddenly it seems to have doubled its speed here, right? But look at this. If we have a look at the data read, which is the data being read from the external drive, that's effectively half the speed of the data written. Now, if you think about that, that's impossible. You cannot write the data like twice as fast as you can read it. The maximum you could write the data is the maximum read speed that you've got. However, what's going on here is that the activity monitor is counting up the speed of both of the individual drives and putting them together. So instead of telling us that it is half of that speed, it's getting it wrong because it is telling us the combined speed of both of the disks. So that's just a bit of a weird anomaly to do with the activity monitor. Okay, so what I've done here is to move both of these test folders into the RAID and then delete them from the external SSD. Now the reason why I've done this is because I basically underestimated how quickly the single 30 gigabyte folder would be written, and what I'm trying to do here is to explain some of the stuff, but we need more data to move so I can explain what is going on with the readings within inside activity monitor here. So to be clear, what's going to happen now, I'm going to move these folders from the RAID 1 back to the external SSD. Now that means that RAID 1, we are measuring its read speed. Now, although we've got no concern about the external drive, we are writing to the external drive. Now in this instance, because the external drive is much faster than the RAID 1 set, this means that the RAID 1 set can read as fast as it possibly can, because the external drive, which is the location where the data is going to, can actually accept that data as fast as the RAID 1 can send. So what we're basically going to see here are two numbers which are going to look basically identical as far as read and write is concerned. So read is going to be the RAID and write is going to be the external. So let me just show you this. Okay, now as we will see here, both of these numbers are effectively going to be exactly the same for the reasons what I've just explained. Now what is really interesting though is that the data read per second is effectively 3 gigabytes per second. Now as we'd seen earlier on in other variations of using the drives individually, or in a JBOD set, that speed was only the same speed as what a single drive was. However, what's happening here, and this is a bit of an assumption on my part, because there are a number of different ways you can actually read when using RAID 1 sets, but the way that this looks like it's doing it with inside like the software RAID setup within macOS, is that it would appear that both of the drives, or let me start again. Although we would only need one of the two drives to read from to actually take the data from, it looks like what's happening here is that it is basically interleaving data from both of the drives. So it's, if you can think about it a bit like odd and even. So you got an odd and even interlace, right? Or interleave. And then what's happening, it's reading half of the data from disk 1 and half of the data from disk 2. So it's basically splitting that data in half from one to the other as far as its reading is concerned. And then it just stitches that back together as a single amount of data going to where it's writing it to. So of course in that instance it is going to be reading twice as fast, because each of the two SSDs within that RAID 1 set are only supplying half of the data, for like the total amount of data that needs to be written, hence why we are getting the twice the speed on the read. Anyways, hopefully I have managed to explain myself there and people have understood the point that I was making. So what I'm going to do now is move over onto RAID 0. Okay, so I'm just going to create a RAID 0 set, but first of all, and once again, let me just eject and then disconnect that 8TB external SSD, because I will be extremely mad if I do something crazy to it, like wipe it out or make it part of a RAID set. Anyway, what I'm going to do now is go to Disk Utility. Again, I'm going to come down here to where it says RAID 1. I'm just going to delete that RAID so we can free up the drives that are within inside that RAID. There we go, that's done. And then I'm going to come up to File. I'm going to go to RAID Assistant, and then I'm going to select, well, it's already on RAID 0, so RAID 0. So I'm just going to tap next there. I'm going to select both of the SSDs, tap next, for the same reasons as I've already explained. 256K for the chunk size and also APFS for the format, and I will call this RAID 0. Now, just before I go any further, although this is called RAID, 0 has absolutely no kind of redundancy whatsoever. So let me just quickly explain what's going to happen here. So we've got two SSDs, both of 4TB in size. When they are combined as RAID 0, they will come back as an 8TB SSD. Now what happens is the system will interleave data to both of them when it is writing to them, and also the same thing when it reads back. So as a for instance, if we had, say, a single video file, what will happen is half of that video file data will be written to drive 1, and then the other half of the data will be written to drive 2. Now, because we are splitting the data equally, what will happen is we will effectively double the speed up from just doing it to a single drive. Now, there is a caveat here, and that is because we are only on Thunderbolt 4 and we have already reached the limits of it with two fast SSDs. Both of these SSDs would indeed operate faster if we raided them to 0 using separate Thunderbolt connections, okay? And this is something that I've shown on a previous video where I took two Thunderbolt 5 SSDs, really fast ones, and then put them in together as a RAID 0, and I was getting over, like, what was it, 11,000 megabytes per second. Basically over 11 gigabytes per second I was getting for like one of the readings. So yes, what's going to happen here is that although it is going to be fast, it is only going to be as fast as the Thunderbolt bus is going to allow it. But to be clear, the combination of both of these SSDs is actually way faster in RAID 0 than what we're going to see here. Okay, so what I'm going to do is just tap on next here and then click create. Okay. and that should be done fairly quickly. There we go. So there's our RAID 0 done. Now I'm just gonna let me get out of disk utility. I'm just gonna quickly go into the Blackmagic Disk Speed Test, and what we're gonna see here is somewhere in the region of 2,800 or something between read and write. So RAID 0, open, start. Okay, so write speed just over 2,800. Read speed, little bit disappointing on the read speed there, so it's just over 2,700. Now, neither of these are exactly twice as fast as what the individual drive is, and the reason why is because there is a little bit of overhead as well being applied here to do with the RAID system itself, as well as some of the overheads that we do have with Thunderbolt. But nonetheless, you know, it's roughly twice as fast because we're using 2 drives. But that is the speed that we're seeing there. Now what I'm going to do is to open up Activity Monitor. I'll come to the RAID 0 here. And then, oops, I've forgotten to attach my 8TB external. Let me pop that in. Okay. I mean, I'd rather forget to connect it than forget to unconnect it and then wipe it out as part of a RAID. So, yeah, I'm okay with that. Okay, all right, let me go to the speed test folder here. And then let me just go back to just using the 30 gig folder. The 30 gig folder is going to be fine here. As I've already said, you know, these drives here are going to maintain super fast speeds for like a very long time. You know, the SLC cache on these particular Western Digitals is the highest of any of the SSDs out there. There are no SSDs out there that have got higher cache limits for any particular size compared to these Western Digitals. So whatever I did here with 30 gigabytes would be exactly the same as 1 gigabyte. In fact, it'd be exactly the same as what it would be with 1 terabyte because the cache limits are so high. Anywho, shut up, Dave. Get on with it. So there we go. As far as the write speed is concerned, as we can see there, 2.9, 2.8. Well, in fact, the write speed is here slightly faster than what the Blackmagic Disk Speed was saying. Okay, so probably more closer to twice the speed of one of the single SSDs there. Let me just empty that bin. Now I'll just come back. So this is the read speed that we're testing for now from the RAID 0. And as we'll see here, okay, yeah, that just tipped over 3 gigabytes. There we go. It's over 3 gigabytes. Okay, so what we're seeing here then are actually speeds which are pretty much close to twice the speed of one of the single SSDs in this particular setup. So yeah, we are a bit faster than what the Blackmagic Disk Speed Test was saying there. But nonetheless, what we're seeing here with RAID 0 is basically the combining of the 2 SSDs in such a way that we can get maximum speed out of them, but we get 0 safety and 0 redundancy. Anywho, let me get on to an end summary. Okay, so to an end summary then, and hopefully what you've just seen there is going to be useful for you to understand basically every single configuration that you could have when connecting an SSD or 2 SSDs to an M4 Mac Mini with this type of enclosure. So obviously I've kind of covered all the basics there for the various RAID options, although as already explained, they're not really RAID except for one of them, and also single disk speed performance and stuff like that. Now, there is something that I really do need to explain here for those people out there who probably already kind of like guessed what was going on with some of the like speeds and stuff, but I'll just clarify it. So, Thunderbolt 4 has the ability to do 40 gigabits per second. Now, by the time we take like all the overheads off and we also account for the PCIe bus speed used, we're talking 20% less than 32,000 megabits per second. It kind of roughly ends up just over 3 gigabytes or so per second when we take all the overheads and whatnot. Now, the way we usually get to that is that we are using 4 PCIe lanes of Gen 3. Now, that means that each lane is
8 gigabits per second, so 4 of them is 32 gigabits per second. Now what that basically means, as I've just said, is that by the time we take off the overheads and stuff like that, we're roughly talking in the region of around 3 gigabytes per second, or just slightly over for like most users. Now as we could clearly see there though, when I was testing for like any type of single disk, like, you know, test, we were like half of that speed, or just below half of that speed. Well, the reason why is because with an enclosure like this, what happens is those 4 PCIe lanes basically get split into 2 sets. So each of the M.2 sockets physically inside of the actual enclosure only have 2 PCIe lanes attached to them. So of course, if that's 2 lanes of PCIe and the PCIe lane for one is 8 gigabits per second, that means that we've got a maximum of 16 gigabits per second for each of the actual 2 sockets. So that's the reason why if we test just one of the 2 SSDs, we get like half of the expected speed that we would normally see on a Thunderbolt 4 system or a 40 gigabits per system. And also, if we were to only have one SSD in, it'd be the exact same. So whether it's got 1 or 2 SSDs in, physically we only have 2 of the PCIe lanes connected to each of the M.2 sockets. Now, of course, what happens is by the time we get into variations where we it is my universal sign for interleaving or interlacing that. By the time we do that with certain, like, you know, configurations of the data, we are back to running at like twice the speed, because we are actually using the 4 lanes at the same time. So as a for instance, in RAID 0, we do get to see that like more of that maximum speed, and in certain instances we'd say, I think RAID 1, where when it's reading, it is also interlacing the data on read, then we also get to see the higher data rate again. However, for anybody who may have been thinking, hold on a minute, those SSDs look a bit slow, they're not. And it's not that Thunderbolt's any slower on this type of enclosure. It's just the way that the PCIe bus lanes have to be assigned physically to the actual M.2 sockets. And another thing with that as well, in the back of my head, I'm thinking, surely that can be dynamically assigned. However, I don't think it can be, which is why it is physically set with 2 PCIe lanes per M.2 socket. Anyway, hopefully that explains some stuff out there for anybody who might have been interested in why they might have been seeing slower speeds than what they were expecting to see with single drive or single disk or single SSD configurations. It gets a bit weird sometimes talking about these things, because technically speaking, they're not disks, are they? Anyway, I'm going to cut myself right off there because I've gone beyond boring and gone straight to super boring. Anyway, like I said at the start of the video, there's going to be links and stuff to everything used in the video description, and there will also be a discount code if you're buying from the Acasis website. And keep an eye on my channel, because I'm going to do a deep dive on this enclosure sometime soon, and there might also be some other things that I'm going to do with it as well. Anywho, if you've liked the video, please do give it a massive thumbs up, and if you really super like the video, a subscription to the channel would be awesome. I'm David Harry, thank you very much for watching this video, take care and goodbye now.